Welcome everyone to the Livestream Hour. I'm Kristin Dziczek, Editor-in-Chief at Ultima Media, and it's really great to have you once again back in my home and connected from around the world as we share some insight on what's happening in the global automotive industry and in the current crisis. So many of you joined us last week, or 2 weeks ago rather, for our first automotive supply chain update live stream. And we're now branching out, broadening that to come at you just about every week with some live interactions, conversations, and insight from our team at Automotive Logistics, Automotive Manufacturing Solutions, Car Design News, and Business Intelligence, and in conversation with industry experts and decision makers, and indeed with all of you who join us in this interactive forum. So welcome again. Today, just a quick running order. We're going to turn particular attention to the U.S. and what's happening in the U.S. Together with my guest Kristin Dziczek from the Center for Automotive Research, whom I'll introduce a little bit later. But we'll start the webinar with the live stream with a bit of a snapshot overview of what's happening in key regions. Won't spend a lot of time there because I'm more than aware of everybody being more than up to date on the news out there in the crisis, but we'll give you a little bit of a snapshot of what's happening across some of the key markets, looking into a recap of our US vehicle sales outlook, which we did share with you before, but we'll give another insight on that. And then I'd like to take you through some of our insights on the key supply chain and manufacturing topics that the industry is facing in the crisis right now, and some recommendations for how the sector can work together to overcome them. And then we'll open up to the Q&A with Kristin and with all of you. And I promise at least by the end, we'll take at least a short break from the coronavirus crisis. So just by way of a short intro, I mentioned our automotive supply chain update from 2 weeks ago, which many of you joined or watched afterwards, and also our Q&A together with Wolfgang Lehmacher. It's kicked off a festival of transformation for us at Ultima Media across our brands. Many of you may have been to any of our live events in the past or familiar with our products. Clearly, in this time, we're all going much more digital, and we all still want to connect as often as possible and bring as much insight to help the industry. So we're lining up, and it's ever developing, but we're lining up more and more content for you. Just a bit of a snapshot of what's coming up just in the coming weeks. After today's US focused live stream, next week we'll talk more about tier supplier production restart. We'll have a special India focus in 2 weeks, and we'll have a broader and bigger data update on the supply chain at the end of the month. And that's alongside other content across supply chain, manufacturing, and design, which we'll be sharing with you. Just a quick word about the platform that you're using, GoToWebinar. Many of you will be familiar with it, but if not, you can pose your questions in the chat box. If there's any technical issues, just put it there as well. Our team will address you separately about it. And there's also a nifty function, which happy to try again if you are. It's the raise hand icon. And that's if somebody is brave enough to want to join in the discussion for a short while on audio, make a comment or point. Just put your hand via the hand signal thing, and I'll unmute you later in the broadcast when we get to the Q&A. As ever, comments, experience, disagreements, very welcome from your side. So let's kick off, as I mentioned, with a short overview of the key things happening across the industry and the supply chain right now. Clearly, as most of you will know, China seems to be, or is partly on the other side of things, at least in terms of production and the economy turning back on. Still very much at a low level, about 50%. Sales were down 50% in March, but that was already a big jump from 80% in February during more of the lockdown period. And perhaps most significantly today, in fact, in China, the Wuhan lockdown ended, or at least was further loosened as people were allowed to leave the city. And if we talked about the GDP impact across China, what we see in Wuhan is perhaps one of the best indications there. Some estimates maybe that GDP fell 50%. There was a very severe lockdown there. The supply chains are still very much in disarray from our sources. All plants are back and running, including automotive plants, but at a low level. So clearly, interesting side of how this crisis began in China, and there was a lot of concern about supplies out of China. At this point, we're probably seeing a lot more issues in China in terms of getting global supply from other shutdown regions from the rest of the world, including Europe. Turning to Europe, and indeed, best message to our Prime Minister, as you know, is intensive care, but there are some signs that Europe is at the peak of the crisis, with some positive signs in cases in Italy, France, and Germany. In terms of automotive industry, almost everything is closed, with a few small exceptions on the assembly side. Kia did start some output in Slovakia this week. We'll be monitoring to see if that continues for the time being. Most plants have a provisional open periods anywhere as early as next week into early May, but in many cases they're rather provisional, and they're rather dependent on the restrictions, supply, and of course demand to come. So even as Austria and Germany talk about loosening some of their restrictions, that's going to take quite a long time to filter through. And it was never particularly the case that the supply chains of plants were mandated shut, but that the non-essential activity certainly meant that with dealerships closed, the production stays off. March sales in Europe were already down 50%. We expect that to go down quite a bit as it carries on. Just sharing a quote we have from an interview we did in Automotive Logistics today with Ford of Europe, Global Purchasing Director. There we can sort of see that although they've set May as the date, obviously issues around worker safety are going to come first, and we're going to talk a little bit more of that later, particularly with Kristin, and output likely to start in quite a limited way. If we turn back to East and Southeast Asia, here the news has kind of gone from good to bad in a way. Japan bringing in state of emergency and further restrictions, not full lockdown, but we've already seen plants starting to shut down, largely due to some supply and demand issues as exports drop off, similar in South Korea. That is likely to continue, and OEMs have largely suspended production in many parts of Thailand, Indonesia, and Vietnam as containment measures tighten. So again, even in regions where this had been perhaps slightly less touched or had seemed to be contained, it isn't over yet. India, sort of no time to lose, if you like. There was a preventative shutdown put in place very, very suddenly at the end of March, and that remains in place. Could see some lifting perhaps as early as next week, but from our sources on the ground, few expect any real restart in production until at least early to mid-May, if not later. There's many issues going on there with the closure of state borders and migrant workers, and questions over what the government support measures there will be. March sales were already down 50%, and that was actually before a lockdown really came into place right at the end. There were some tax changes there, so really, India will face quite a challenge there, and we're going to have some more specific content to do with the Indian supply chain, as I mentioned, just in 2 weeks. Latin America is a sort of potential ticking time bomb here. It's not the case in every market, but we've seen obviously some discrepancies between how the restrictions have been put in place or at least emphasized in key places like Brazil and Mexico, and that actually could obviously lead to a bigger outbreak later on. And again, we're going to talk about some of the supply chain risks that might well bring, especially to the US and Mexico. March sales were already going down pretty sharply, even before this hit in March in Mexico. That was a little like a sprint around the world, coming into the US with a little bit more focus now, where we're going to spend most of this discussion, although a lot of the topics will naturally apply across the global supply chain. Again, virtually all North America plants are closed. There are, similar to Europe, some provisional restarts set as early as next week, including Volkswagen, Hyundai, Kia. We'll see how they go, how they phase in. Most others are set targeting more in the May period, but again, the larger OEMs tend to talk in indefinite terms, and we'll wage largely on the progress of the restrictions in place. And as we see And as I just learned speaking with Kristin before, the Michigan lockdown was in fact just extended, and we're likely to not see those lockdowns eased up, certainly in major markets like Northeast and Midwest right now. We're going to talk about this in more detail, but there's a lot of focus right now in the industry, clearly on supporting the relief effort around ventilator production and sourcing protective equipment, but actually that's going to be quite a big topic for the industry itself, as we'll come on to. Lots of questions as well over some of the regulatory and trade issues, especially around USMCA implementation, which we're going to come to shortly. March sales were down nearly 40%, and that was before a lot of restrictions went in place more widely, and indeed are going to stay in place through at least April. This is just a short recap. Again, we presented this 2 weeks ago in more detail, and there's a link there. You can download the full report just on our current forecast for the U.S. market from our analyst, Daniel Harrison, and our business intelligence division. And this was from 2 weeks ago, and I spoke to Daniel earlier, and probably would already look again at that best case of minus 6% seems very optimistic now. But the base case and worst case range there, looking between 14 or up to 28% drop, is certainly where we see things possibly heading. A lot of things will factor into that, which of course we can't entirely predict right now, around the path of the virus and some of the impact of the further stimulus measures to come, and in the global economy in terms of whether we're really looking at a V, which unfortunately most considered optimistic, versus a U or a W or an L-shaped recovery. What that stands for, okay, VUL, yeah, at sort of best, depends a lot on other measures to come. But we're certainly, unfortunately at the moment, not necessarily looking at a V shape. So I just wanted to share in terms of some of the insights from us at Ultima Media, where our conversations with market and our insights have been pointing to around some of the major issues in the supply chain, certainly facing in the US, and these are issues that we're going to talk through in more depth with Kristin. So clearly, liquidity is a major issue. This is across the economy, but clearly we see particular risks for smaller suppliers. And the impacts that could have across the total supply chain. The industry is obviously widely reducing hours, furloughing staff, and laying off staff. Big moves to extend credit lines and loans, and obviously to in line with some of the federal stimulus out there. But we do see some risks in terms of some providers and companies who could be running out of cash much sooner than later. And that could lead to some accelerations and consolidation if action isn't taken. What can the industry do, or indeed what is the industry doing in some parts? We do see, or we do think one aspect could be where that liquidity is coming through to the larger companies, like especially the OEMs. Could then help to support the distressed supply base, including through faster payments, maintaining contracts, and helping credit lines there. I think that could play a key role. We think that could play a key role for many companies. And then clearly, this will be key is how the industry works together in coordinating restarts. This will be quite a shock to the system, and then we'll need some careful collaboration and calibration. And that will particularly play a role for some of the more weaker companies on the ground. Supply and logistics constraints. Now, we all broadly would appreciate that the demand shock is the scariest aspect of this, but clearly coming out of in some of the restart, supply and logistics constraints could certainly play a big role. And we see it in other parts of the supply chain right now, with non-automotive, but in the food supply chain and other trade, the border closures and delays, border queues, safety checks, lack of driver facilities on the roads. This is all causing other issues in the supply chain, which could continue as automotive production starts off, and we're still very much in a containment phase in other parts of the country and the economy. Clearly, in the global supply chain, or even the much more regional supply chain in North America, the issues, restrictions happening in those regions will play a big role in monitoring sourcing parts and material from those regions, and in terms of how that could then impact on production in the US. And clearly we will have issues, and this started from January at the beginning of the crisis, around misalignment of containers and inventory and equipment, and realigning the supply chain, and indeed perhaps other freight constraints and risks across the logistics chain. What can the industry do? Well, something we're seeing a lot of is more cross-functional task force to handle this. This is across departments at manufacturers, certainly taking a daily approach to tracking the inventory and monitoring the supply base to see whether constraints alternatives have to be considered and how this develops. See a lot of good reason for that to move even from across companies to certainly across industry. And also in terms of the logistics side of things, there's potential to collaborate with providers on storing key supplies and products. So if you have parts that have been built at origin but don't have a place to move to, arranging either storage in those origins to kind of avoid the export costs at the moment, but still have tracking of it, or indeed to arrange alternative storage and movement at and close to destination. So this is again something that the industry can already start working with its supply base and providers to do. The other kind of key issue, which we think will play a big role in any kind of production restart, is around employee and facility safety. We're entering a new world here, and we don't necessarily see one in which, although the virus may well be contained, the curve flattens, we're not in a, without any kind of vaccine. There's still many measures that will need to be in place to protect workers and to protect the places where they work. So whether that's aligning for social distancing in the workplace, disinfection of surfaces, shift changes to allow all that, and perhaps a big one, provision of protection, PPE, personal protective equipment, to whether that's face masks, shields, sanitizers, and this could be actually a huge demand, and probably something which it's not necessarily the same equipment, but at a time when the PPE equipment is very much needed on the front lines of the relief effort. It may be an issue right now, but certainly will be an issue for the industry going forward. Something further perhaps to touch on later in the Q&A is whether testing, ramping up of testing might help to mitigate some of this as well. What can the industry do right now? Well, some of it we see is some proactive efforts to redesign workflows and look at facilities, material flow in plants, warehouses, offices, to protect workers when the restart begins. Perhaps establishing, of course, industry guidelines on these safety measures, and including the PPE standards. And this is one, again, if as the industry turns to the relief effort and tries to source more ventilators and build and source more ventilators for relief and face masks, this is a supply chain which can perhaps be amplified coming out of the crisis to help support their own employees' own staff. So that, if you like, was some of the key insights that we're seeing across the industry right now, and some recommendations. It sort of leads me to want to ask you as the audience to start thinking a little bit around some of the questions which we're certainly asking amongst our editors and journalists, and we're getting from our audiences in terms of some of the issues that the sector is facing in terms of the survival period, the government support mechanisms, again the trade issue which we're going to come on to, supply risks, and managing those redesign of processes and tests to prevent spread, and perhaps also looking at the overall impact of U.S. competitiveness in the global supply chain, and what the crisis recovery looks like, maybe to hopefully have some good news later on what that might look like. So that's a bit of an overview from my side. What I'll do before I bring Kristin on, I thought I might turn to you all in a short poll, just to get your viewpoint on how some things are in the industry are going. So I wanted to ask you first to get your opinion on when production restarts, how long it will take your plant or supply chain to run smoothly. So up to 2 weeks, up to 4 weeks, up to 6 weeks, up to 8 weeks, longer than 8 weeks. I see our audience is moving through voting now. So if you can give us your vote, let us know what you, how long you think it will take. And I will, polling has come way through the majority now. So if you can just take another second to vote. Let's close the poll. And it's pretty tight split there. I mean, the small majority see it up to 4 weeks. But actually, I think if you obviously do some math there, you can see that for most, it's going to take quite well. Overall, we're looking at a fairly lengthy restart period to get smoothly again. I mean, up more than a fifth still think it will take longer than 8 weeks. Big majority see it as happening, taking at least more than a month. So interesting to get your view on that. I'll ask one more quick question, and then let's move on to a broader Q&A. So let's say we're going to ask, besides lower demand, which clearly is a major issue in the restart, what do you see as the biggest risk to resuming production at scale? Do you think it's going to be the insolvency or closure of companies in the supply chain? Do you think it's component and inventory shortages from affected regions? Do you think it's labor shortages at plants and in the supply chain? Logistics capacity bottlenecks, or what I mentioned earlier around adapting facilities to new health measures? So let us know what you think, besides the demand shock, the biggest risk to resuming production at scale is. So I'll just give it another minute to let you finish voting. And we're coming through the majority have voted now, and let's close that. Okay, very interesting set of results here. So 34% component and inventory shortages from affected regions, which of course, you know, in the case could also mean different regions of the U.S. Could mean other countries, other Mexico. Could obviously mean deeper in Europe, but not too far behind insolvency or closures of companies in the supply chain. That's some of the biggest risks that you're seeing. Okay, very interesting there. I would now like to introduce our special guest for this session, and we'll turn our webcams on so that we can spend some time looking at you. Hi, Kristin. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, hi, I can hear you fine.
Great. So Kristin Dziczek leads research at Center for Automotive Research, which is an influential research group covering quite a few disciplines across the U.S. automotive industry and the supply chain. Quite a recognized expert on labor, on automotive labor and automotive economics, and has followed this issue, I think it's fair to say, pretty carefully and closely with her organization. So, Kristin, I thought, why don't we start just with some of your perspectives on how this crisis has developed, perhaps based from a supply chain manufacturing point of view, for the U.S. and of course the broader region, and where we kind of brings us to now as we move into the next phase of it.
Well, thank you for having me, and it's nice to be here. It's you know, I think it's very rare as a forecaster and somebody who, you know, tries to look at, you know, the future of this industry that we get a serial event like this, where something happens in one region, moves to another region, moves to another, and we see, you know, differential government responses, and certainly, you know, differentials in demographics and population density and a number of other things that change the course of the disease. And, you know, different countries are doing different measures. South Korea, Germany are, you know, operating under, you know, wide testing regimes that are seeming to bend their curves pretty well. But it's very, very rare that we have that kind of insight into a lot of different approaches to the same problem across the world, and then in a serial nature across different regions. So, you know, there are some things we can learn from that. You know, the way I see it, there's really three big things. There's a bucket of disruption, parts disruption and supplier disruption. You know, many of the things that were in your poll, you know, are suppliers going to make, you know, bridge this gap? Are we going to have shutdowns in different regions of the world or even different regions of the United States that impact our ability to continue to produce vehicles at a much lower scale, obviously, to start with. The second is what's happening with demand. And demand here in the US, as you mentioned, down 40% in March. That tracks pretty closely with the demand fall off in China in February. They're 6 or so weeks ahead of us. And then, what does that look like on the other side? So, demand and supply have to be aligned, and we've got, some significant inventory. So even if demand came back strongly, does that pull production? And that's a question. And then the third bucket is really, how do we protect worker health and safety when we go back to work? And, it's a measures of distancing, sanitation, isolation for people who start to feel sick at work. How do you handle visitors to the plant and contractors? Just a whole wide range of things that companies need to be considering. And of course, many automakers and suppliers have moved into personal protective equipment manufacturing. And while that's good to augment the supply of those much needed products for the health and frontline, the police and fire and health systems workers and grocery store workers and other essentials, it's going to be really necessary when we restart automotive production. A shift in an automotive assembly plant's 1,500 people. We've got a whole bunch of assembly plants all over North America, and if we are up at 1 or 2 shifts in all of those plants, we're talking millions of masks that we're going to need, and the ability to produce some of those from the auto industry itself may be needed for some time until there is a way to mitigate the spread of this disease, either through vaccine or other ways that they're looking at to transfer antibodies to people that will protect the population more broadly.
It's as you mentioned, such an unprecedented issue. I mean, when we talk about supply chain disruption in the past, biggest incidents like the Japanese tsunami, for example, which obviously closed off aspects of Japan. There's been incidences in the US on a smaller scale. How can the industry even begin to start coordinating this sort of restart and this sort of level?
Right, and I think one thing to note is those past disruptions. There was a resin supplier in Europe that had a shutdown that affected the whole industry. We had here in North America, the magnesium fire that shut down F-Series pickup trucks. That's about 10% of US production output, is just that one vehicle series with Ford. Those are one-time events. They're a shock, and then there's a recovery. This is an ongoing rolling crisis. So it's not just, it happened and now we recover from it and we, mitigate and figure out how to realign. It is an ongoing challenge every day for people in supply chain and logistics and production to figure out how we're going to respond to different changes happening all over the world. So I think that's a really big change from what we saw before. And the restart. So here in Michigan, there's a group of companies and led largely by suppliers, and Magna International, one of the largest North American suppliers, is leading some of this charge. I've got a conversation with Magna's Executive Vice President and President of Magna Asia, Jim Tobin, and their Chief Human Resources Officer today at 1 o'clock Eastern. You can register for that for free on cargroup.org. But we're going to go through the industry restart playbook and all of those considerations that we're thinking about those measures in the plant, those measures that supply chains have to put in place, and how much longer do we have to continue to produce PPE to supply just the industry's own needs, as well as healthcare workers and first responders and essential frontline folks.
So I mean, we saw that in the poll. Okay, it was second to component shortages, which we'll come on to. But do you think that those risks of failures, insolvencies in the supply chain is something that we'll face a big risk of? And does the government, the CARES, the federal stimulus program, go any way to help address this?
Well, the liquidity issues are going to loom large. Of course, suppliers are paid on 30, 60-day terms and still continuing to be paid right now. That's unwinding the automaker working capital, as they're not getting any revenue in the door, but they're still paying suppliers. And so really the length of the shutdown matters a lot, and how well prepared suppliers are to restart and have the working capital to restart. That was a big issue when we had bankruptcy of 2 automakers in the US with GM and FCA. Getting that working capital to the supply base was really important. And what was really different then was that the D3 were crippled, but other automakers were still producing. So a small supplier that had a diverse customer portfolio may still be getting some money in the door from producing for the international automakers in North America. But these, everyone is down. So it's a real cut. Bridging that gap is really important. The US federal government has a couple of programs out for loan guarantees to larger firms on about, it's going to leverage about $4.5 trillion worth of lending to all industries. And that's the other difference. This is all industries and not just, auto is not unique. So the airlines and all of that are affected, and, aerospace and restaurants and just every business under the sun is impacted. And then they put out $250 billion to small businesses. And that is likely to be oversubscribed. The U.S. Treasury Secretary has now said that they're going to ask to augment that that fund. The program launched on Friday, and it is offering loans and forgivable loans to small manufacturers. Now, the automotive supply chain in the U.S., 78% of the suppliers that are categorized as motor vehicle parts have firms that are less than 100 employees. So these are, this is a vast majority of the firms. It's not the employment or the revenue, but it's, it only takes one little supplier to really mess up production, as we've seen. So that, making sure those small suppliers bridge this gap and have a workforce to come up on the other side and begin producing again is really important. And then, the integration of North America, we're very concerned about the spread of the disease in the U.S. And different regions of the U.S. may, have their outbreaks happen at different times. Today is supposed to be the peak in Michigan, according to the University of Washington model. So, maybe that means we flatten out and start to improve, and we'll see when we see the death tolls and all of that get launched later today. But the disease has not taken hold as widespread in Mexico. The Mexican government response has been a little bit behind where Canada and the U.S. is, and Mexico is responsible for about 40% of the U.S. imports of parts. So they're Mexico's #1 source, Canada's the second largest source, China's the third largest source of automotive parts imports to the U.S. So really very concerned about those other regions. Europe as a whole is a big source as well, but it differentially impacts automakers depending on, how connected they are to Europe. So FCA may be, is still getting vehicles and parts and engines and transmissions out of their European operations, whereas GM and Ford are less reliant on those operations. And then, of course, the Japanese are dependent on a lot more Japanese sources. And so, depending on the course of the disease, we may see differential impacts by automaker.
Absolutely. How about the point worth mentioning there when we talk about all the plants being closed? We do tend to mean the assembly plants, but some of these component plants actually are still having some levels of operation, and certainly with moving some imports and exports in and out of Europe and China as well. On the kind of broader point of the, that global supply chain or regional supply chain, clearly that feels part of a lot of issues and discussions in recent years. Clearly, we've had the trade wars and discussions about near sourcing and certain levels of protectionism. There's also some potential arguments to be made about supply chain resilience and what the role of inventory and process of all that comes together, both coming out of this crisis, which might be one thing, and then in the kind of years kind of ahead. What's your sort of take on the shape of how the kind of current automotive pattern, if you like, of just-in-time and global sourcing may be impacted as a result of this?
I think there's really, two competing schools of thought on what happens to global supply chains. there's one that is clearly the one that is held by the U.S. current administration, and that is bring more stuff to the United States, bring more stuff closer to home, and then we're not reliant on getting things out of a very competitive market halfway around the world, and that time on the water and all of those disruptions that we're facing. The other side is put more eggs in more baskets. And try to mitigate the risk by spreading it around a little bit more. So I do think we'll see higher inventory buffers. It's pretty interesting because we've fully embraced the Toyota production system throughout the industry. It has provided great agility, but maybe not so much on resilience. And the resilience may cause us to have to build up a little bit more in the inventory stores. The inventory coming out of China, we already had, most suppliers are carrying a month or 2 months of inventory close and local. There's, 30 to 60 days on the water. So, I don't even think we saw the full brunt of the Chinese parts supply disruption in North America by the time it hit here. So right now, China's priming the pump, coming back online and putting more on the water and coming to the US. So that might be mitigating some of those disruptions. But I think, it's really going to be a struggle between more eggs in the North American or US basket versus those who are pushing for lots of eggs and lots of baskets.
Absolutely. And I mean, of course, if we track the kind of the disruption of the sequencing, what we were seeing on this side, for example, in Europe, was initially the concern, of course, about China. Very quickly became the concern about Italy, very quickly became the concern about Spain. And then obviously it all shut down before it could become quite that sort of issue. But obviously that in some ways the near sourcing was part of the bigger risk, at least in the short term, because when a Spanish supplier who supplies Germany with a day's worth of inventory, for example, shuts down from tomorrow, then you run out after a day versus the pipeline. So right. We've seen it not to be quite as facile an argument as that, but clearly I mean, this is a hard one to predict, but on the policy side, we've certainly seen a protectionist sentiment out of the US. Hard to know what the future of that will look like. But if we were to kind of pull this into the USMCA for the moment, shifting track, which clearly is unrelated but also related now, because I believe the scheduling for the USMCA implementation is coming upon the industry now that it's been ratified. You've written about the need for potentially pushing that back. Why would that be important right now?
Well, it generally takes about 3 to 6 months to put in place the uniform regulations that are needed to implement a trade agreement. And this is a pretty complicated trade agreement with a lot of new provisions in it that automakers and suppliers have not dealt with before. And while they've seen the broad contours of the agreement, they knew that there was going to be a steel and aluminum purchasing requirement or a labor value requirement, and higher thresholds for broader section of automotive content. They don't yet know the exact specifics about how you certify that you've complied. And the provisions or the procedures that had to be put in place before they could even start that have now completed in both Canada and Mexico. The US has not completed that and notified the other two partners as of this morning when I got up this morning. It may have happened today, but once that goes into place, the trade agreement can usually happen in the first day of the third month following those notifications. And right now the administration is pushing for a June 1st start date. So, that's 8 weeks or so from now, and a much more accelerated time frame. And, that's putting it on the backs of an industry already reeling from supply chain disruptions and demand disruption and healthcare issues in the plants, a lot more financially struggling, and it's going to cost some money to comply with these new rules. And so the industry has started asking for a little breathing room. While they do support the goals of the USMCA and intend to comply, they're looking for a later entry into force date. And Mexico and Canada, it's reported in the news this morning that they are meeting, or actually it was yesterday, that they're meeting together to try to put the whole agreement into force, but delay the automotive rules and give the automotive industry a little bit of breathing room to come back up into production before they have to implement rules. And I think the biggest concerns for the industry would be if we had provisional rules that then were later changed, so they had to align their systems twice, and I think Canada and Mexico are not wanting to do this, or if we had different rules for complying to the same agreement in one or more of the countries. So you could end up with something like that. It might be, if they move forward with the June 1st date, just easier to pay the tariff, the 2.5% tariff on parts and passenger cars. Certainly trucks, it's very difficult to imagine any automaker being able to eat the 25% tariff on imported pickup trucks. But the 2.5% may be less expensive to delay the work that you'd have to do to put in force the compliance inside each automaker and supplier. And then some of the automakers are going to need to draw on information from their supply base in order to comply, and that adds a whole other level of complexity and time that's required to do that.
Just to clarify, the implementation, I mean, there would still be a period of time to meet those local sourcing requirements. I mean, surely that wasn't going to be in 90 days, was it? Was that still has a phase in to reach the higher steel and the higher local North America?
There's a 3-year phase-in of the rules. So starting at, it's a very, very different agreement. The NAFTA, which remains in place now, has a 62.5% content rule on a set list of products that are on the tracing list. There's different rules about how you count things that are not on that tracing list. And so anything not on the tracing list can be called deemed originating. Deemed originating goes away with this new agreement. And they do allow some roll up. So, anything that is complying to the rule can be 100% applied to compliance for other purposes of the rule. But they start off at a 65% content rule on vehicles, and it over 3 years goes to 75%. So it's a little bit of a jump from 62.5, and a very big logistical jump because of the change in the structure from a tracing list to these broad categories of parts.
Especially in the kind of ramp up phase and recovery phase, is there any basis to lower other tariffs in terms of getting the industry back on its feet? And you mentioned, I think China has still the third source there, and obviously the other ones. Do you think that should or could be a consideration?
I don't know if this administration would embrace that. There's been some talk about whether they would delay collection of tariffs, not delay the tariffs, but just delay the collection in order to push the financial hit a couple months out, 60 or 90 days out into the future. And I don't see any resolve to those issues yet. But delaying the collection of tariffs is about as far as they've been willing to go. And of course, the administration is now relying on the economic advisor, who's a big China hawk, Peter Navarro, to lead the Defense Production Act activities. So the putting into force the government's massive purchasing power to get the things that they need into the national stockpile. So he's off doing that. And I think trade is a big component of our ability to get the personal protective equipment and medical medicines and medical devices that we need in order to confront this disease.
Absolutely. I had a question from the audience that I thought I'd turn to here, and this is: should automakers reduce their product portfolio or reduce variance, especially in this case interiors, in order to make restart easier for suppliers, or actually to sort of simplify the product mix, if you like, in the temporary ramp-up phase?
I expect to see that, yes. And I also expect to see the first vehicles in the queue for restart are those that make the most money. So they'll be trying to get the highest margin vehicles into production, so that there's more revenue coming in the door for the automakers. I do expect also there could be redefinition or realignment of the payment terms to suppliers to try to keep suppliers afloat through this. Even if you're a supplier that's not on a high margin vehicle, you'd still need to be there when your product launches, maybe a few weeks or months later. So there could be some need to carry suppliers that are more tied to, say, pass car or where there's very little margin, so that they're still there. So it's good for suppliers to have a diversity of programs that they support, but there's some that are much more tied to the less profitable segments, and that's going to be a challenge for them.
There's another question. I mean, in this case, it's making references to European legislation, but I think we can also tie it into a US context to a certain extent. So the question is, do you see any impact on the emission legislation Euro 7 and the ambition electrification model plans? Now, clearly, the US has a rather different regulatory framework and recently loosened even further. So that's perhaps one thing to point out in that context. Nonetheless, there's obviously plenty of EV plans, GM and Honda GM building a huge battery plant in Ohio. I mean, do you see any potential knock shift on the electrification plans that we had seen going into this, maybe specifically in terms of the US market and production?
I think the production plans and the vehicles that are in the pipeline are staying in the pipeline, but I do expect that we would see delays in those programs, and not just from the cash standpoint of the automakers, but also from the demand side. Last week I ventured forth from my home and I filled my vehicle with petrol or fuel, and at about $1.35 a gallon. I've been watching the gas prices here in the U.S. Certainly, the dispute between Saudi Arabia and Russia is part of that, but just the demand fall off. The vehicle return on investment for electric vehicles is going to be much more challenged in a low gas price environment. And what kind of incentives can there be on the consumer side to get people into the vehicles that we know we need for compliance to other markets? The other concern, I think, for automakers and suppliers is what happens this November. The presidential election could change the occupant of the White House. I'm not political and I'm not going to hazard a guess of what happens, but I know everyone's bracing for a sharp swing of the pendulum should the Democrats win the White House, or if they take over the Senate and the House, that the regulatory environment could change dramatically. So I don't think anybody's, partying in the streets about the slowed compliance or the change that the Trump administration put out this month or late last month about fuel economy and greenhouse gas emissions. And those are, decisions in and of themselves that are going to be challenged in court for some time. So, staying on a track of compliance, having those products in the pipeline, but the cash crunch is going to determine what moves forward. It's important to note, though, in 2008, 2009, GM, basically put everything on the shelf except for the Chevrolet Volt. So, that was one of the only vehicles where the product development and the plans moved forward apace. And I do think that, there's such a commitment to electrification for several automakers that it will still be a big thing. And you mentioned the GM Honda tie-up. They've been tied up on transmissions for some time. The co-production tie-up that's announced last week is a really important one. And I think we'll see a lot more of that as the competition for capital for new products, for R&D, for the automation of factories that's going to be needed to provide more distancing and spacing between workers as this contagion continues. There's going to be a lot of demand on cash. And so, those kinds of partnerships or tie-ups are going, and any outright mergers are going to continue.
Let's talk a little bit more about those protective measures and health measures, because it's quite an interesting topic in terms of some of the potential changes to processor layouts that or potentially would be in an auto industry, which is all about takt times and capacity utilization. How could we even imagine some of these plants being profitable if they have to maintain all these distances, if they have to take a lot of extra time to clean equipment, let alone the sourcing of the PPE? What discussions are happening in the industry on that front right now? Is that sort of moving towards that new reality, or is it different. I know we're going to hear more about that tonight, so we'll tune in for that webinar. But what have you picked up so far?
Well, exactly. You know, the webinar we're doing at 1 o'clock Eastern at cargroup.org will have a lot more of that information about how that's working. But, you know, the industry is trying to synchronize and put in place the same sorts of measures across. It's extremely challenging. You know, lots of workers on the front lines, you know, medical workers, police officers, grocery store workers are succumbing to the disease because they don't have the protections and the ability to social distance as is required. And we will be in an environment without a vaccine or an effective treatment for some time, but the economy is going to need to restart in that period. The playbooks that I've seen so far, you know, mention a lot of screening and testing. Now here in the US, that also comes up against, we have health information protection, it's called HIPAA, an act that says nobody can know your medical status about any kind of disease that you have. That's going to go right up against HIPAA protections on, you know, whether people can know your disease status on any kind of thing you have. There's, you know, what happens if somebody falls ill in the plant? Where do they isolate? How does a health officer engage in that? You know, you might have 1,500 people show up in an insurance office building every day and, you know, process claims and do underwriting and stuff, but maybe only 100 of them touch the same coffee machine or use the same restroom facilities or something like that. In a plant, you have 1,500 people show up and all touch the same product as it goes down the line. So the PPE, the distancing, partitions, phased shifts, phased lunches, it's all in all going to lower the capacity of the automakers straight out. I mean, you know, the 2 shift straight time capacity, those numbers are going to come down. They're not going to be able to produce at that level of capacity for some time as they have a slowed line, more distancing, and perhaps even, as I mentioned, more automation that they'll have to introduce into the plant in areas where there's workers in close quarters doing things. You know, I think about, you know, as a vehicle goes down the line, there's a lot of times where people are doing left and right simultaneously, like, you know, installing seatbelt anchors in the vehicle itself. You're inches from the other person when you're doing that, and that's not going to work. So you're going to have to do, you know, change the jobs around so that somebody's doing the right seatbelt anchors while somebody else is doing the left, you know, rear view mirror or something that's on the other side of the car and 6 feet away. I do think we'll see something from organized labor here as well, and that might be a differential between automakers and suppliers, where organized labor is represents the workforce and places where they do not. The UAW has had losses themselves inside their own organization. People in the president's office has succumbed to COVID-19, as well as, you know, it's a daily headline in the Detroit papers here. There's very few industries or employers where COVID deaths are reported. You know, so many workers from Ford, so many workers from FCA. You know, we might hear a nurse or a teacher or this, and, you know, it's not. It's their occupation that leads, not their employer that leads often. But the employer lead COVID death stories here in Detroit are a daily drumbeat that does make workers much more concerned about going into the plants, having those interactions, and potentially bringing the disease home to their families. Another thing that has happened for first responders and medical personnel is that they've been given the option in some cases to stay in college dorms that are currently empty, hotels that are currently empty. And I don't know if we might see something similar for workers who go back to work in this very important economic sector.
Absolutely. Well, let's try to kind of end on a potential positive note. If we looked at the last crisis, I know it's not to compare, but the financial crisis, the auto industry in the U.S. especially really had something of a renaissance after 2009 for about 10 years, really. Is there any hope to think that this could lead to another sort of renaissance, or is this such a different? And I don't mean specifically how long it takes, but the conditions that went into the financial crisis and came out, and some of the capacity changes and debt changes. but do we have some hope out of this crisis that we might see another renaissance in however many years' time?
I hope so. I really do hope so. I mean, it's very difficult to tell. You know, the 2008-2009 crisis, we were looking at, you know, a very sharp decline in, you know, market share and capacity utilization. We had a lot of excess plant capacity in North America that had to be shed, and you know, the companies were able to get some of their long-term liabilities off their balance sheets in the process of the bankruptcy wash, and come back, you know, a much stronger companies. So that is the one positive, is that these companies are much better prepared for a downturn in the industry. But you know, this is a downturn like nobody had planned for. The renaissance on the other side is entirely possible. I think, you know, I have mentioned a couple of times in the last few days, you know, the late Sergio Marchionne's presentation on Confessions of a Capital Junkie. The capital requirements of this industry are immense, and maybe this does draw together partners and joint ventures and tie-ups that allow for a more efficient use of capital, and you know, greater product availability and choice for consumers. So, you know, I think that we could see a lot more changes in that way. I do worry a lot about that social distancing measures in the plant will require there to be more automation, and that would mean lower employment in the sector. So, you know, declining employment means that the industry becomes that much more, each job supports many more jobs in the US economy, as the weight of the whole supply chain is on them, but there will be fewer of those jobs in the end. So that's not so much uplifting, I'm sorry, but I do think, you know, we will have to be more efficient at the use of capital in the years coming out of this.
Absolutely. Well, listen, Kristin. I mean, although you couldn't send us off all in the best mood, I think you definitely shared some very interesting insight, and really appreciate that. I would recommend the audience to check out CAR in general, Center for Automotive Research, with a lot of the research it does, and the webinars that were mentioned. I will look forward to having Kristin on again in the future as we exchange more on this side, both from the US and global point of view. So Kristin, thanks again. We'll make sure this will be published soon, and we'll share more and more with you guys going forward. So thanks, and stay safe as well over there in Michigan. And let's hope it is the peak and we're coming down off the curve there.
I sure hope so. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. So to our audience, I'll just, I promised you a short break from Corona when we finish. So, or as we sort of finish. So what I thought I would do, or just to sort of say, there were a few other questions that came through, and we sort of ran out of time there. We will get those questions addressed and make sure that they're sent out, and we share some of that. So we'll get a few follow-ups on some of the questions. Just for a little bit of maybe relief, if we can. Sorry. From what we're seeing, you know, at Ultimate Media, as mentioned, we're three brands: automotive logistics, automotive manufacturing, and car design. A couple of stories on our website that I thought I'd just point you to that might get your mind slightly off of the crisis. Quite very nice review of the Precept, which is Polestar's a new concept from Polestar, the first, if you like, complete Polestar concept, not really derived from a Volvo product. Have a read of that. It's a really lovely, beautiful concept, and also, you know, to tie us into the industry and the supply chain, Polestar is producing in China, and obviously a brand with some growth connected to Volvo and Geely. So have a look at that. And then over at AMS, where our manufacturing title, interesting story about a new mobile maintenance app in Ingolstadt, which Audi has to sort of help increase the visibility of tooling and equipment in the plant virtually. I promise it wasn't a Corona story, and it's not, but this sort of connectivity and visibility might actually go some way in future to helping maintain some of the distances, and obviously increasing some of the automation that we'll likely see coming out of that. So have a look at that story too. I think you get some interesting insight. there's also a link there to a virtual tour of the Audi plant, which unfortunately is probably all most of us can do right now and hope for. So, have a look over that. And both of those stories you can register on our sites and read them. Just to kind of kicking off, as I mentioned, we're going forward with our festival of transformation. We'll have more content next week. We're going to have a lot more sessions planned over the coming weeks and indeed months in the spring and summer. And really it's just a call as much as possible for you not only to participate where you can, but in terms of joining in on our live streams, asking questions, as many as you did again today, or if you want to get involved directly, if you think you have some perspectives to share, data, get in touch with us. Myself, my colleague Nima Shladwa, and all of us here, we're really interested to engage and share with you during this time, and indeed going out of it. The Festival of Transformation, we hope will lead right into the return of live events for us later in the year, but clearly also in a hybrid with all that we're doing online, which I think many of you agree these sort of work processes aren't going to change, and that will be the same for us. So it was my pleasure to host you again on our live stream. Thanks so much again to Kristin Dziczek from CAR. Thanks to all of you for all the attention and time. We'll send you over the slides, and the video audio will be available afterwards. Stay safe, everyone. Have a good long weekend if you have one coming up, and we'll see you next week.